Hi, in this video we're going to look at taking softwood cuttings. It's a type of propagation, so propagation includes all the different ways that we can use to make new plants. So that includes propagating from seed, it includes dividing, so lifting plants and splitting them, and then you've got two, and it includes cuttings. The particular type of cutting we're going to look at today is softwood cuttings, and we'll look a bit more at the different types of cuttings that you can take in a minute. So here we've got three plants that I took from softwood cuttings last year. We've got lemon verbena, a perennial kale and a rosemary. So the first question I'll look at is which plants you can take cuttings from. The big clue is that you can only take cuttings from plants that are perennial, so plants that have a life cycle that lasts for more than 1 year. That can include woody perennials, so perennial plants that put on a woody growth and they keep their structure over winter, and it can include herbaceous perennials, which are plants that die right back in the winter and then come back up from the roots in the following spring. You can't take cuttings from annuals, their life cycle is just 1 year, so that individual plant will grow from seed, go to flower, set seed, and then that plant will die off at the end of the year. So the things that you need for taking cuttings are a pot to put them in, some compost, and it needs to be well draining, because one of the things that can happen is that the new cuttings rot if they stay too wet. So you want good free draining compost. So I'm adding a bit of vermiculite here. You could add sand or even a bit of grit. A plastic bag, because the other thing that can happen is that the cuttings dry off very easily. So making a mini greenhouse for them means that it holds in the moisture a bit more. There's some sticks to prop up the greenhouse, and either a pair of sharp secateurs or a sharp knife. It's important, or both, it's important that their tools are really sharp and clean, because we're going to be working with material that's quite delicate, so we want to have nice clean cuts. So here we're looking at the difference between softwood and hardwood. The softwood is basically this year's growth in the spring. So we're here at the end of May, and all of this soft, bendy growth on the rosemary has grown this year. If we zoom in there, you can see the hardwood, and as we go up, that would have been probably last year's growth, and as we go further down the plant, we see older growth until we get to the very woody base. When you hear about cuttings or read about them, often you'll see three different types. Softwood, which is this year's growth in late spring, early summer. Hardwood, which is this year's growth but at the end of the year, so in the autumn or sort of early winter. So it's just the previous year's growth after it's hardened off. And semi-ripe, which is in between. So it's this year's growth, and in a few months, by late summer, July, August, this very soft bendy growth will have hardened up a bit. It'll sort of toughened up, and that's the semi-ripe stage. So here in late May we're looking at softwood cuttings from this year's growth, this lovely bendy growth. And softwood cuttings are, there's lots of plants that you can propagate by softwood cuttings. Lots of herbs are particularly good to do like this, so rosemary, thyme, sage, marjoram, lavender. So this morning we're going to look at propagating some rosemary using the softwood, and so we'll have a look at how it's done. So here at this rosemary bush we're going to collect some material to do the cuttings with. I'm going lower down on the rosemary bush just because there the new growth is slightly longer, it's stretching up towards the light, whereas at the top it's all quite short. And what we want is ideally around 7.5 centimetres to put in the pot. So the longer, as long as possible really. I'm going to cut them slightly longer than I need, and I can always trim them down when we go back in to actually pop them in the pot. I'm going to take the material, take it quite low, and there just got that bit of new growth. That's about probably nearly 15 centimetres long. You can see that's all this year's new floppy growth. I've actually got a little bag that I'm going to pop them in, because as soon as I take them off the plant on a hot morning like this, they'll start drying out. So I want to stop them drying out as much as possible. And I'm going to take about 10 little cuttings ready to take back and put in the pot. So now to take the cuttings, I'm going to take each individual piece and cut almost all the leaves off. It's important to cut the leaves off because this bit is going to go underneath this compost, and if the leaves are there, they'll also rot off and they can cause rotting in the cutting. I'm using a knife just because it's a bit easier than with secateurs, and it's also recommended to actually cut the stem with a knife rather than secateurs, so it's less likely to crush the delicate tissue in there. So the place where the cutting will root from is actually at these nodes here. So I'm going to try and put it in the compost with as many nodes as possible underneath the layer of compost. So I think I can get two in. So as I cut it, I'm cutting just below a node. I'm using a pencil to make a hole in the compost and just dropping it in. So cutting the side leaves off, cutting across the little piece just below a node. Make a little hole. And tuck it in. So here I've got the cuttings. I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 cuttings in this 20 centimetre pot. I pre-watered the compost, so it's really nice and moist. Because the cuttings are still really delicate, I've just removed them from their roots, so they'll be really prone to drying out. So in an effort to keep the moisture in, I'm just giving them this little greenhouse propped up with some sticks to keep the plastic off the seedlings. This isn't absolutely critical, and there is a risk with having a plastic bag over that they'll get sweaty and actually rot. So you can put them somewhere, but I put them somewhere shady, just so they're not losing too much moisture. And that's basically it. You should know within about a month whether they've rooted or not. And what I'd suggest is definitely don't poke around with the cuttings. But if you look underneath and you start to see roots coming out, that's a sure sign that they've taken. And if you start to see growth on the cuttings themselves, that's a sign that they've taken.